The Galactic Council chambers stretched out like a vast metal cathedral, filled with the voices of 100 different species. Representatives from across the known galaxy sat in their designated sections, each group keeping to their own kind. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert clicks, growls, and musical tones into something resembling universal communication. Captain Lisa Martinez sat in the human section, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced attention of a soldier. She had been to dozens of these diplomatic meetings over the past 5 years, and they always followed the same pattern. The powerful species talked loudly about trade routes and territorial disputes, while the smaller delegations tried to make themselves heard above the noise. But today her attention kept drifting to a figure sitting alone in the Nootka section. Ambassador Zeth Kar had once been a legend among his people. Lisa had heard the stories from other military officers who had fought alongside Nootka scouts during the border conflicts. They spoke of warriors who could track a single ship across 3 star systems, who could move through asteroid fields like ghosts, and who knew the deep space routes better than most navigation computers. The being sitting before her bore little resemblance to those stories. Zeth Kar's once powerful frame was locked into a complex mobility chair that kept his broken body alive. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that helped him breathe and move. His compound eyes, still sharp and intelligent, tracked every movement in the chamber, but his body remained perfectly still. The injury had happened 3 years ago during the Battle of Kepler 442. Lisa remembered reading the reports. Zeth Kar had been leading a scouting mission when enemy forces ambushed his ship. He had managed to transmit critical intelligence that saved thousands of lives before his vessel was destroyed. The rescue teams found him floating in the wreckage, his spine shattered and his nervous system damaged beyond repair. Most species would have honored such a warrior with a quiet retirement. The Nootka had done something different. They had kept him alive with their advanced medical technology and given him a position as an ambassador. It was meant to be respectful, but Lisa could see the truth in how the other Nootka delegates treated him. They spoke around him rather than to him. They made decisions without asking his opinion. They had turned a war hero into a living monument. The other species in the council were even worse. The proud Xentorians would not even look in his direction. The trade-focused Millicents treated him like a piece of furniture. Even some of the human diplomats seemed uncomfortable around him, as if his condition might somehow be contagious. Ambassador Johnson from Earth was giving another speech about mining rights when the emergency alarms began to sound. The chamber's lights shifted to a harsh red glow as automated voices began announcing evacuation procedures in dozens of languages. Lisa was on her feet immediately, her military training taking over as she assessed the situation. Chaos erupted throughout the chamber as hundreds of beings rushed toward the exit tunnels. The larger species pushed past the smaller ones without concern. Delegation leaders shouted orders to their staff while security forces tried to maintain some semblance of order. It was exactly the kind of panic that got people killed. Lisa watched the Nootka delegation gathering near their exit tunnel. They moved with military precision, each member knowing their role in the evacuation plan. But they left someone behind. Zeth Kar sat motionless in his section, his mobility chair unable to navigate through the pressing crowd. His own people had abandoned him without a second thought. She started moving toward him before she had consciously made the decision. Other humans called her name as she pushed against the flow of evacuees, but she ignored them. By the time she reached the Nootka section, the chamber was nearly empty except for a few stragglers and the lone figure in the mobility chair. Zeth Kar looked up as she approached, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting in patterns she could not read. When he spoke, his voice came through a translation device attached to his chair, turning his natural clicking sounds into heavily accented standard. "Captain Martinez," he said, recognizing her rank insignia. "You should evacuate with your people. This station may not survive whatever is attacking us." Lisa knelt beside his chair and began examining the complex machinery that kept him alive. Life support systems, mobility controls, and communication devices were all integrated into a single unit that probably weighed more than she did. But it was designed to be portable. She could see the quick-release connections and backup power systems that would allow the chair to function independently. Maybe, she said, starting to disconnect the chair from the station's power grid. But I'm not leaving without you. Zethkar's head tilted in what might have been surprise. I do not understand. Your own species awaits you. I am no longer of value to anyone. The Nootka Council has made this clear by their actions. Lisa hefted the chair's power pack onto her shoulders and began pushing the mobility unit toward the nearest emergency exit. The chair was heavy, but her years of military service had left her strong enough to manage it. More importantly, she had operated similar medical equipment during combat rescues. That's where you're wrong, she told him, as they entered the corridor. I've been watching you during these sessions. You see things the rest of us miss. You notice when delegates are lying, when they're nervous, when they're planning something. Your people might think you're broken, but your mind is still the sharpest thing in that room. They moved through corridors filled with emergency lighting and the distant sounds of weapons fire. Whatever was attacking the station had already breached the outer hull. Lisa could feel the vibrations of explosions through the deck plating beneath their feet. Zethkar remained silent for several minutes as she navigated around debris and damaged sections of the corridor. When he finally spoke, his translated voice carried something that might have been wonder. In 3 years, you are the first being to suggest that I might still have value beyond what I once was. Lisa paused to check her route on a wall display. The main evacuation bays were all compromised, but there were emergency pods on the lower levels that might still be functional. She adjusted her grip on the mobility chair and continued moving. Then everyone else has been looking at the wrong things, she said simply. The emergency corridor stretched ahead of them like a tunnel through hell. Red lights flashed in rhythm with the station's dying heartbeat, while automated systems announced damage reports in calm voices that seemed completely disconnected from the chaos around them. Lisa pushed Zethkar's mobility chair through sections where the artificial gravity flickered on and off, making each step a careful calculation. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew closer. Whatever had attacked the Galactic Council station was not interested in taking prisoners. Lisa had heard enough weapon signatures during her military career to recognize the difference between a raid and an extermination. This was the latter. Left, at the next junction, Zethkar said quietly, his compound eyes studying a tactical display that had materialized above his chair. The attackers are systematically destroying each section after they clear it. They do not want survivors. Lisa followed his directions without question. She had quickly learned that the Nootka Scout's ability to process multiple data streams simultaneously was far beyond human capability. While she could barely keep track of their current location, he was monitoring enemy movement patterns, station damage reports, and escape route options all at the same time. How do you know all this? She asked as they turned into a maintenance shaft that seemed barely wide enough for the mobility chair. Nootka Scouts are trained to fight an enemy called the Void Seekers, Zethkar explained. Ancient machines that consume biological life to fuel their expansion. Their attack patterns are very specific. They isolate, eliminate, and harvest. What we are experiencing matches their methods exactly. The maintenance shaft opened into a cargo bay that had been abandoned during the evacuation. Shipping containers floated freely in the reduced gravity, creating a maze of obstacles. Lisa carefully maneuvered the mobility chair between them, while Zethkar continued his analysis. If these are Void Seekers, then escape will be more difficult than we anticipated, he continued. They track biological signatures across vast distances. Simply leaving the station will not ensure our safety. Lisa paused beside a particularly large container to catch her breath. The mobility chair's power pack was heavy, and they had been traveling for over an hour through increasingly damaged sections of the station. Her military conditioning kept her going, but she could feel fatigue building in her shoulders and legs. So, what do we do? She asked. Zethkar's head turned toward her with a movement that was surprisingly quick despite his paralyzed body. We find a way to mask our life signs long enough to reach a planet where we can properly hide. There are techniques my people developed during the ancient wars, but they require specific conditions. An explosion somewhere above them sent debris raining down into the cargo bay. One of the floating containers crashed into the deck plating. Near their position, its contents spilling out in a shower of spare parts and emergency supplies. Lisa quickly gathered what looked useful while Zethkar directed her toward items that might help with their escape. "That emergency beacon," he said, indicating a small device among the scattered supplies, "and those thermal regulators. If we can modify them properly, we might be able to create a temporary masking field." Lisa collected the items and secured them to the mobility chair's equipment rack. She was starting to understand why Nootka scouts had such fearsome reputations. Even paralyzed and dependent on life support, Zethkar was thinking 3 steps ahead of their current situation. They reached the emergency pod bay, just as another section of the station suffered catastrophic decompression. The sound of atmosphere venting into space was like a scream that echoed through the metal corridors. Lisa counted 12 pods remaining in their launch tubes, but she could see from the status lights that only 3 were still functional. "The smallest one," Zethkar advised as she helped him transfer from the mobility chair into the pod's passenger compartment. Void seekers prioritize larger targets. A single-person escape pod might avoid their immediate attention. The transfer was awkward and time-consuming. Zethkar's life support systems had to be carefully disconnected from the mobility chair and reconnected to the pod's emergency medical station. Lisa found herself handling equipment she barely understood, following his precise instructions while trying not to think about what would happen if she made a mistake. "Why are you doing this?" Zethkar asked as she worked to secure his breathing apparatus to the pod's oxygen supply. "Your people could have safely evacuated hours ago. You have risked everything to help someone your own species barely acknowledges." Lisa paused in her work to look at him directly. His compound eyes reflected the pod's interior lighting in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. She had been asking herself the same question since she first decided to approach his abandoned position in the council chamber. "During the war with the hegemony, my unit was trapped behind enemy lines for 6 weeks, she said, returning to her work with the life support connections. "We had a communications specialist who got injured in the first week. Couldn't walk, could barely speak, but he kept our radio equipment working. Without him, we would have died out there. My commanding officer wanted to leave him behind when we finally got a chance to escape." She finished connecting the last of the life support tubes and began preparing the pod for launch. "I told him that anybody who would abandon a wounded teammate was not someone I wanted to serve under. We carried that specialist out on our backs, and he went on to save dozens of other units with the intelligence he had gathered." Zethkar remained silent as the pod's launch sequence initiated. Through the small viewport, they could see the station's superstructure collapsing as the Void Seekers continued their systematic destruction. In the distance, other escape pods were being hunted down and destroyed by sleek metallic ships that moved with predatory grace. "Your species is strange," Zethkar finally said, as their pod ejected from the dying station. "Most beings understand the logic of abandoning the weak to save the strong. But humans seem to find strength in protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Lisa strapped herself into the pilot's seat and began programming their course toward the nearest inhabited system. "Maybe that's why we keep surviving things that should kill us." Their pod drifted away from the station just as the main reactor finally failed. The explosion lit up the surrounding space like a small star being born and dying in the same instant. Lisa watched in the rear display as the Void Seeker ships turned their attention to hunting down the remaining survivors. "Where are we going?" Zethkar asked. Lisa smiled grimly as she engaged the pod's small hyperspace drive. "Somewhere they won't think to look for us. Granite Peak Colony. It's a human frontier world that most people have never heard of. Mountain. Folk who keep to themselves and don't ask too many questions." As the stars shifted around them and the pod entered hyperspace, she added quietly, "And if there's going to be a fight, I can't think of anyone I'd rather have with me than a Nootka." "Scout." The escape pod screamed through Granite Peak's atmosphere like a falling star, its heat shields glowing white-hot as Lisa fought to maintain control. The planet's mountains rose up to meet them in jagged peaks that could tear apart anything moving too fast. She had visited this world twice before during supply runs, but landing here in a damaged emergency pod was far different from arriving in a proper transport. Zethkar remained silent during the descent, his compound eyes tracking the instrument readings that Lisa could barely follow while concentrating on not crashing them into a mountainside. His life support systems beeped steadily in the background, a mechanical heartbeat that had become strangely comforting during their journey. The pod hit the ground hard enough to rattle Lisa's teeth and send a shower of sparks from damaged electronics. When the motion finally stopped, she found herself hanging upside down in her restraints with snow drifting through a crack in the hull. Outside, she could hear the wind howling through pine trees and the distant sound of water running over rocks. "Status report," she said, more to herself than to Zethkar as she began checking systems. "Life support is functional, but operating on backup power," he replied, his translated voice calm despite their situation. "Hull integrity is compromised, but not catastrophically. We have perhaps 6 hours before my medical systems require recharging." Lisa worked her way out of the restraints and began gathering their supplies. The pod had landed in a narrow valley, between 2 mountain ridges, surrounded by trees that had probably never seen a spaceship before. Snow covered everything in a white blanket that made the landscape look peaceful and welcoming. But she knew that mountain weather could change quickly. Moving Zethkar and his equipment from the crashed pod to safe shelter turned out to be the most challenging thing Lisa had done since basic training. The mobility chair had been damaged during the crash, leaving her to carry both the Nootka Scout and his life support systems manually. His paralyzed body was lighter than she had expected, but the medical equipment was bulky and fragile. She found a cave system about half a mile from the crash site, hidden behind a waterfall that would mask any energy signatures from scanning devices. Getting everything inside required multiple trips through knee-deep snow, but the cave was dry and large enough to set up a proper shelter. "This location is tactically sound," Zethkar observed as Lisa worked to establish a camp. "The waterfall will interfere with most scanning methods, and the cave provides natural shielding. Your frontier people chose this world well." Lisa had contacted the nearest settlement during their approach, and she could see lights moving through the forest as the local residents came to investigate the crash. Granite Peak Colony was home to maybe 3,000 people spread across dozens of small communities. They were miners, farmers, and crafters who had come here to live simply and independently. Most of them had never seen an alien before. Mayor Jake Sullivan arrived first, leading a group of volunteers equipped with medical supplies and rescue equipment. He was a tall man with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of mountain living. Lisa had met him during her previous visits and knew him to be practical and fair-minded, but she had no idea how he would react to their current situation. "Captain Martinez," he said, pushing through the cave entrance with snow still clinging to his heavy coat. "We saw your ship come down. Anyone hurt?" Lisa gestured toward where Zethkar lay, connected to his life support systems. "I have a wounded ally who needs medical attention. He's not human." Sullivan's eyes widened as he took in the Nootka Scout's insectoid features and complex medical equipment. But he did not step back or show fear. Instead, he knelt beside the life support unit and began examining it with the careful attention of someone who had spent years maintaining complex machinery in harsh conditions. "Never seen anything like this," he admitted. "But the principles look similar to the mining equipment we use for deep excavation. Doc Rogers is on his way. He might have some ideas about how to help." The other volunteers had gathered at the cave entrance, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity and concern. Lisa recognized several of them from her previous visits. These were people who had chosen frontier life specifically to avoid the complications of galactic politics, but they were also people who understood that survival sometimes required helping strangers. "There's more," Lisa said, addressing the group. "We were attacked by enemies who might follow us here. Staying to help us could put your entire colony at risk." Sullivan looked around at his people, reading their expressions in the way that good leaders learn to do. After a moment, he nodded as if some silent vote had been taken. "Well," he said simply, "guess we better figure out how to defend ourselves then." Dr. Ben Rogers arrived an hour later, carrying a medical kit that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and determination. He was younger than Sullivan, but moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had learned to make do with limited resources. Lisa watched him examine Zethkar's life support systems with growing amazement. "This is incredible," Rogers muttered, as he traced the connections between various devices. It's like they've miniaturized an entire hospital into something portable. The neural interface alone is decades ahead of anything we have. Zethkar had been unconscious for most of the examination, but his eyes opened as Rogers worked to improve the connections between his equipment and the cave's power supply. When he spoke, his translated voice was weaker than before. "Doctor, I do not expect your people to risk themselves for someone they do not know. If it would be safer for your colony, you may leave me here and evacuate to a more secure location." Rogers looked up from his work with an expression of surprise. "Leave you here? Son, I've been a frontier doctor for 15 years. I've never abandoned a patient yet, and I'm not starting now." Sullivan nodded in agreement. "Besides, Captain Martinez says you know things about fighting these enemies. Seems to me we'll be safer with you than without you." Lisa felt something, tight in her chest, begin to relax. She had hoped that the mountain people would help, but she had not been certain. Granite Peak Colony existed specifically because its residents wanted to avoid the complications of galactic civilization. Asking them to shelter an alien refugee and potentially face attack from unknown enemies was a significant request, but as she watched the volunteers work to make Zethkar comfortable and secure the cave against potential threats, she realized that she had underestimated what frontier communities were really about. These people had not come to the mountains to hide from responsibility. They had come here to build something worth protecting. "What do we do now?" Sullivan asked as they finished setting up the improved life support systems. Zethkar's compound eyes focused on him with an intensity that seemed to surprise the mayor. "Now we prepare for war. The Void Seekers will follow our trail eventually, and when they arrive, they will not be interested in negotiation or surrender. But there are ways to fight them that do not require advanced technology. Ways that your people can learn." Lisa smiled as she saw the expressions on the faces around her. Fear was there, certainly, but it was mixed with determination and curiosity. These were people who had chosen to make their lives in an unforgiving environment. They understood that survival often required learning new skills quickly. "Then I guess we better get started," Sullivan said. 3 weeks had passed since Lisa and Zethkar arrived on Granite Peak, and the mountain colony had settled into an uneasy routine of preparation and watchfulness. The cave behind the waterfall had been transformed into a command center filled with communications equipment salvaged from their crashed pod and medical devices keeping the Nootka scout alive. Local volunteers took turns monitoring the systems while learning basic alien technology from someone who could barely move. Lisa stood at the cave entrance, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below. The settlement looked peaceful in the early light, with smoke rising from chimneys and people beginning their daily work. Children played in the snow while their parents tended to livestock and maintained equipment. It was hard to believe that somewhere in space, ancient machines were hunting for them. Behind her, Zethkar worked with a group of teenagers who had proven surprisingly good at understanding his technical explanations. Amy Chen and Bobby Martinez sat beside his life support unit, their young faces serious as they studied displays showing energy patterns and detection methods. Other kids their age were learning tracking skills from retired miners who had spent decades reading the subtle signs that mountains left behind. "Captain," called Tom Bradley, the local blacksmith who had become their unofficial communications specialist. "We're getting some strange readings from the outer sensor grid." Lisa moved to the monitoring station where Bradley was studying data, feeds from devices they had placed throughout the surrounding valleys. The sensors were crude by galactic standards, but they were sensitive enough to detect unusual energy signatures or movement patterns. For 3 weeks, they had shown nothing but normal mountain wildlife and weather. Now the displays showed something different, small anomalies in the electromagnetic spectrum, barely detectable but consistent with advanced technology operating under stealth conditions. The signatures appeared randomly across different locations, as if something was systematically scanning the area while trying to remain hidden. "How long has this been going on?" Lisa asked. "Started about 6 hours ago," Bradley replied. "Real subtle at first, but it's getting stronger. Whatever's out there is getting closer." Zethkar had been listening from his position across the cave. Now his compound eyes focused on the sensor displays with an intensity that made everyone else stop what they were doing. "Show me the pattern distribution," he said quietly. Bradley transferred the data to Zethkar's personal display system. The Nootka scout studied it for several minutes while his life support systems hummed in the background. When he finally spoke, his translated voice carried a note of grim certainty. "Void Seekers," he confirmed. "They have found our trail and are conducting a systematic search of this region. The pattern indicates at least 3 hunter units working in coordination." Lisa felt her stomach tighten. They had known this moment would come eventually, but 3 weeks of peace had made it easy to hope that their enemies might have given up the pursuit. "How much time do we have?" "Based on their current search pattern, they will locate this settlement within 2 days, Zethkar replied. "Possibly less if they detect any significant energy emissions or large gatherings of biological life signs." The cave fell silent, except for the sound of water falling outside and the steady beeping of medical equipment. Lisa looked around at the faces of the people who had chosen to help them, Sullivan and Rogers, who had coordinated the colony's preparations, Bradley and Farmer Helen Cross, who had learned to operate alien technology, the teenagers who had become Zethkar's students. All of them were about to face an enemy that most galactic military forces could not defeat. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Sullivan asked, his practical nature demanding concrete information. Zethkar's display shifted to show tactical data about Void Seeker hunter units. The images were unsettling. Biomechanical creatures that combined organic tissue with advanced machinery, designed specifically for tracking and eliminating biological life forms. Individual hunters are approximately 12 feet tall and possess adaptive armor that can adjust to different weapons and environmental conditions, Zethkar explained. They are powered by biological energy matrices that make them stronger and faster with each life form they consume. Conventional weapons are largely ineffective because they learn from each attack. Young Amy Chen raised her hand like she was in school. "So how do you fight something that gets stronger every time? You hit it?" "You do not fight them directly," Zethkar replied. "You use their strengths against them. Void Seekers are efficient hunters because they follow predictable patterns based on logical analysis. But logic can become a weakness when facing opponents who refuse to behave logically." Lisa understood what he meant. During her military career, she had seen small units defeat much larger forces by using unconventional tactics that confused enemy commanders. The key was making your opponents rely on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. "We need to start the evacuation," she said. "Get the children and non-combatants to the deep caves on the North Ridge. They'll be safer there and it will give us room to maneuver." Sullivan nodded and began organizing the evacuation procedures they had planned, but hoped never to use. Within an hour, families were packing essential supplies and moving toward defensive positions that had been prepared throughout the mountain valleys. The colony transformed from a peaceful settlement into something resembling a military base, with everyone knowing their role in the coming battle. But even as people moved with practiced efficiency, Lisa could see the fear in their faces. These were brave people who had chosen frontier life precisely because they were willing to face unknown challenges. However, facing ancient alien killing machines was beyond anything they had imagined when they came to Granite Peak. Dr. Rogers approached Zethkar's position with medical equipment designed to make the life support systems more portable. "We're going to need to move you to a more secure location," he said. "The hunters will target this cave once they detect the energy signatures from your equipment." "No," Zethkar replied firmly. "Moving me will only endanger more people, and my equipment will be detectable regardless of location. I should remain here and serve as bait while your people prepare their defenses." Lisa knelt beside his life support unit, her face showing the stubborn expression that had become familiar to everyone in the cave. "We've had this conversation before. Nobody gets left behind. Captain Martinez, you must think logically about this situation," Zethkar said. "I am a liability that cannot contribute to combat operations. Protecting me reduces your chances of survival and serves no tactical purpose." "You're wrong about that," Amy Chen interrupted, surprising everyone with her confident tone. You're not a liability. You're our secret weapon. She pointed to the displays showing hunter movement patterns and the defensive plans they had developed, based on Zethkar's knowledge. None of us would know how to fight these things without you. You can see patterns we miss and think of strategies we would never consider. Just because you can't run around with a gun doesn't mean you're not fighting. The other teenagers nodded in agreement, and Lisa saw something change in Zethkar's compound eyes. For 3 years, he had been treated as a broken remnant of his former self. But these human children saw him as something different. A teacher, a strategist, and a warrior whose greatest battles were fought with his mind rather than his body. Besides, Bobby Martinez added with the casual confidence of youth, if we're going to beat impossible odds, we need someone who knows how to do impossible things. Outside the cave, the first warning alarms began to sound as the outer sensor grid detected movement that was definitely not local wildlife. The hunt had begun. The training began before dawn with Lisa leading a group of 20 volunteers through the forest above the settlement. Snow crunched beneath their feet as they moved in single file, each person trying to follow the movement techniques that Zethkar had taught them through careful demonstration and patient correction. What looked simple when the Nootka scout explained it turned out to be incredibly difficult when humans tried to copy it. Smaller steps, Lisa called softly to the group. Think about where you place each foot before you commit your weight. Zethkar says most species move too quickly and create patterns that machines can predict. Behind her, farmer Helen Cross struggled to match the careful rhythm that Zethkar had described. She was used to working long days in difficult conditions, but this kind of precise movement required different muscles and a completely different mindset. How did his people ever learn this stuff? She whispered. Practice, replied Tom Bradley, who was having his own difficulties with the alien techniques. Lots and lots of practice. Back in the cave, Zethkar worked with a different group on what he called stealth breathing. The concept seemed ridiculous at first, changing the way you breathe to make yourself harder to detect. But when he explained how void seekers tracked biological signatures, it began to make sense. Your species breathes very regularly compared to most life forms, he told the assembled teenagers and adults. This makes you easy to identify from a distance. But if you can alter your respiratory pattern to mimic local wildlife, you become much harder to distinguish from background noise. Amy Chen sat cross-legged beside his life support unit, practicing the breathing exercises with the focused intensity she usually reserved for her schoolwork. Like this? She asked, demonstrating a pattern that mimicked the local deer they had been studying. Better, Zethkar replied. But remember that you must maintain this pattern even under stress. When you are frightened or excited, your natural reflexes will try to take over. Dr. Rogers watched from across the cave, taking notes on techniques that seemed to blend medical knowledge with military tactics. As a frontier physician, he was used to dealing with unusual situations, but learning alien combat methods from a paralyzed scout was definitely beyond his normal experience. This is fascinating, he said during a break in the training. You're essentially teaching them to control autonomous biological functions that most people never think about. Survival often requires doing things that seem impossible, Zethkar replied. Your species appears to have an unusual talent for this kind of adaptation. The compliment was delivered in the flat, translated tones of the communication device, but Rogers could hear something that might have been genuine admiration behind the mechanical voice. Over the past 3 weeks, he had watched Zethkar work with the colonists and had become increasingly impressed with the aliens' teaching methods. Most military instructors Rogers had known tended to be harsh and demanding, breaking people down before building them back up. Zethkar took a completely different approach. He treated each student as an individual with unique capabilities and limitations, adjusting his methods to match their learning styles. The teenagers responded especially well to his patient explanations and willingness to answer even the most basic questions. Why are you helping us? Rogers asked during a quiet moment when most of the trainees were practicing in other parts of the cave. Your own people abandoned you. You could have just let Lisa evacuate with her unit and avoided all this. Zethkar's compound eyes turned toward him with that unsettling directness that made it seem like he was seeing more than just the surface of things. For 3 years, I believed that my value as a warrior had ended with my injury. Every interaction with my own people reinforced this belief. They honored what I had been but had no use for what I had become. He paused while his life support systems cycled through their routine maintenance procedures. Captain Martinez and your people have shown me something different. They see capabilities where others see only limitations. They ask what I can do, rather than focusing on what I cannot do. The sound of returning footsteps announced the arrival of the forest training group. Lisa entered the cave with snow melting from her hair and a satisfied expression on her face. Behind her, the volunteers looked tired but pleased with their progress. We managed to cover 3 miles without triggering any of the motion sensors, she reported to Zethkar. Helen even managed to sneak up on a deer without spooking it. Helen Cross looked surprised by her own success. I never thought I'd be learning hunting skills from an alien, she said with a smile. My grandmother would have found this whole situation pretty entertaining. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman, Zethkar replied. The best warriors are often those who can learn from unexpected teachers. The afternoon training session focused on what Zethkar called environmental integration. This involved using natural materials and local terrain features to create hiding places and weapons that void seekers would not immediately recognize as threats. The colonists learned to weave branches and snow into camouflage that could fool, advance sensors, and to modify ordinary tools into devices capable of disrupting alien technology. Bobby Martinez had turned out to have an unexpected talent for this kind of improvisation. Working with guidance from Zethkar and assistance from Tom Bradley, he had created several devices that could generate electromagnetic pulses using components salvaged from mining equipment and household electronics. The key is understanding that void seekers classify threats based on recognizable patterns, Zethkar explained as Bobby demonstrated his latest creation. A weapon that looks like farming equipment will not trigger their defensive responses until it is too late. Mayor Sullivan watched the training exercises with the expression of someone trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. He had served in the colonial militia during his younger years and understood conventional military tactics, but this was something entirely different. It's like you're teaching them to think like ghosts, he observed. In a sense, yes, Zethkar agreed. Void seekers are designed to hunt biological life forms that behave in predictable ways. But your species seems to have a natural talent for behaving unpredictably. As evening approached, the training groups gathered in the main cave to share what they had learned and discuss the defensive plans that were taking shape. Lisa studied tactical displays showing the positions where they would make their stand, while volunteers compared notes on techniques that had worked well and others that needed more practice. How long until they get here? Amy Chen asked, her earlier enthusiasm now tempered with realistic concern about what they were facing. Zethkar consulted his sensor displays, which showed the void seeker search pattern continuing to close in on their location. Less than 18 hours, he replied. They will likely attack during the night when they expect your people to be at their most vulnerable. Then we better get some rest, Lisa said. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day. As the volunteers settled down for what might be their last peaceful night, Zethkar remained awake, monitoring the approaching threat and making final adjustments to their defensive strategy. Through the cave entrance, he could see stars shining above the mountain peaks, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt like a warrior again. The first attack came just after midnight, announced not by alarms or explosions but by a silence that fell across the mountain like a heavy blanket. The normal sounds of night wildlife stopped abruptly, leaving only the wind moving through pine, trees, and the distant rumble of water flowing over rocks. Lisa woke immediately, her military instincts recognizing the wrongness of such complete quiet. In the command cave, Zethkar was already tracking the enemy's approach on his tactical displays. 3 biomechanical hunters moved through the forest, with predatory grace, their adaptive armor shifting color and texture to match the surrounding environment. They were barely visible even to the advanced sensors, appearing as ghostly outlines that flickered in and out of detection range. They're testing our perimeter, Zethkar reported as Lisa took her position at the communication station. Standard void seeker tactics, They will probe for weaknesses before committing to a full assault. Around the cave, volunteers moved to their assigned positions with the quiet efficiency they had practiced over the past weeks. Tom Bradley activated the modified mining equipment that would serve as their primary weapons. Helen Cross and her team prepared the camouflaged positions they had constructed throughout the valley. Dr. Rogers checked the portable medical station they had established in the deepest part of the cave system. "Remember what we learned?" Lisa said into her communication headset, speaking to the defenders scattered throughout the mountains. "Don't try to fight them head-on. Use the techniques Zethkar taught us. Make them come to us on our terms." The first hunter emerged from the tree line near the settlement's main buildings, moving with mechanical precision as it scanned for life signs. It was even more disturbing in reality than it had appeared in Zethkar's tactical briefings. 12 feet tall and covered in armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal, it combined the worst aspects of machine efficiency with organic predatory instincts. Mayor Sullivan and his team watched from a concealed position as the creature methodically examined each building, its sensors probing for biological signatures. They had evacuated all the obvious shelters and left only carefully prepared decoys that would draw the hunters away from the real defensive positions. "It's going for the school," Sullivan whispered into his radio. Just like Zethkar predicted. The hunter approached the building that had been set up to look like a refugee shelter. Energy readings suggested multiple human life signs inside, making it an attractive target for a creature designed to consume biological life. But as soon as it breached the entrance, Bobby Martinez's improvised electromagnetic pulse device activated, sending a surge of disrupted energy through the hunter's systems. The creature staggered but did not fall. Its adaptive armor quickly compensated for the electrical attack. But the momentary confusion gave Helen Cross and her team the opening they needed. Using modified agricultural equipment, disguised as farming tools, they struck at the hunter's joints and sensor clusters, while it was still recovering from the pulse. "It's working," Helen reported breathlessly as the hunter retreated toward the forest. "The camouflage fooled its targeting systems long enough for us to land several hits." But even as they celebrated the small victory, Zethkar's displays showed the other two hunters adapting their approach based on what the first one had learned. Void Seekers shared information instantaneously, meaning that tactics which worked once would be much less effective on subsequent attempts. "They know about the pulse weapons now," Zethkar warned, "and they have identified several of your hiding positions. Prepare for a coordinated assault." The second wave came from 3 directions simultaneously, with each hunter using different tactics based on the intelligence gathered from the first attack. One approached from above, using the mountainous terrain to avoid the ground-based defenses. Another circled around to attack from the rear, while the third moved directly through the center of the settlement, ignoring the decoy positions entirely. Lisa found herself face-to-face with the hunter that had infiltrated their rear defenses. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying than she had imagined. Its biomechanical face showed no emotion as it raised weapons that seemed to grow from its arms like organic extensions. She rolled aside just as energy bolts tore through the position where she had been standing. "Remember your training," she muttered to herself, using the breathing techniques and movement patterns that Zethkar had taught them. Instead of running directly away from the hunter, she moved in the seemingly random pattern that mimicked local wildlife behavior. The tactic worked better than she had dared hope. The hunter's targeting systems, calibrated to track fleeing prey, had difficulty maintaining a lock on something that moved like a confused deer, rather than a panicked human. Lisa used the confusion to reach one of the prepared weapon caches, grabbing a device that Tom Bradley had created from mining laser components. The modified laser caught the hunter by surprise, cutting through its adaptive armor at a joint that had not yet adjusted to this type of attack. The creature's right arm fell away in a spray of mechanical fluids and organic tissue, but it continued fighting with its remaining weapons. Throughout the valley, similar battles raged as human defenders used alien tactics to confuse and outmaneuver their attackers. Amy Chen and her team had turned the old mining tunnels into a maze of false passages and hidden traps, leading one hunter on a chase that ended with it trapped beneath tons of carefully placed rockfall. But the cost was higher than they had hoped. Dr. Rogers worked frantically to treat injuries as volunteers were brought to the medical station. Burns from energy weapons, cuts from falling debris, and exhaustion from the sustained fighting left many of the defenders in need of immediate care. "We can't keep this up indefinitely," Rogers reported to the command cave. "The hunters are learning, too quickly. Each attack is more effective than the last." Zethkar studied his tactical displays, watching as the remaining hunters regrouped for what would probably be their final assault. The creatures had lost significant capabilities during the fighting, but they had also learned enough about human defensive tactics to make the next attack much more dangerous. "They will strike at dawn," he predicted. "All remaining units working in perfect coordination. They have identified our command center and will focus their attack here." Lisa checked her weapons and ammunition while considering their remaining options. The volunteers had fought better than anyone had expected, using Zethkar's teachings to hold off creatures that should have overwhelmed them easily. But they were running out of surprises, and the hunters were adapting faster than they could develop new tactics. "How many do we have left?" she asked. "2 hunters remain functional," Zethkar replied. "But they now possess complete intelligence about our capabilities and defensive positions. The next attack will be their strongest." Through the cave entrance, Lisa could see the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the sky above the mountain peaks. Somewhere out there, ancient killing machines were preparing for one final assault against a group of frontier colonists who had never asked to be part of an interstellar war. "Then we better make sure we're ready for them," she said simply. In the medical station, Dr. Rogers continued working on the wounded while listening to the radio traffic that coordinated their final preparations. He had signed up to be a frontier physician, not a combat medic, but war had a way of changing everyone's job description. "Whatever happens next," he said to no one in particular, "these people have already proven something important." Outside, the hunters began their approach as the sun rose over Granite Peak Colony. Dawn brought more than just sunlight to Granite Peak Colony. The distant rumble of spacecraft engines echoed through the mountain valleys as 3 Nootka military vessels descended toward the settlement. Lisa watched from the cave entrance as the sleek ships landed in the main clearing, their arrival stirring up clouds of snow and debris that glittered in the morning light. "Reinforcements," she said, feeling a mixture of relief and concern. Help was welcome, but she had learned enough about galactic politics to know that military intervention often came with complications. Inside the cave, Zethkar observed the arrival of his people with compound eyes that showed no readable emotion. His life support systems continued their steady rhythm, while tactical displays updated to show the new variables that the Nootka ships brought to their situation. 3 light cruisers, he reported, probably carrying a total of 60 warriors and advanced scanning equipment. They will have detected the Void Seeker signatures and come to investigate. Commander Veltar of the Nootka expedition entered the cave an hour later, moving with the fluid grace that marked his species' natural warriors. He was everything that Zethkar had once been, powerful, confident, and completely focused on military objectives. His compound eyes took in the human defensive preparations with professional assessment before settling on his paralyzed countryman, Scout. "Zethkar," he said in the clicking language of the Nootka, which the translation devices converted into formal standard. "We detected Void Seeker activity in this system and came to investigate. We did not expect to find you here." "Commander," Zethkar replied with equal formality, "these humans provided shelter when I was in need. They have fought bravely against the hunters using tactics I taught them." Veltar studied the cave's jury-rigged equipment and the exhausted human volunteers who were preparing for another attack. His assessment was clearly less charitable than Zethkar's. Primitive weapons and improvised defenses. They have done well for their level of technology, but this situation requires proper military intervention. Lisa stepped forward, recognizing the tone of someone who was about to make decisions for other people without consulting them. "Commander, with respect, these people have homes and families here. They're not going to abandon their colony just because the fighting gets difficult." "Captain Martinez," Veltar replied, his translated voice carrying the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "2 Void Seeker hunters remain active in this area. Our ships can evacuate the human population to safety, while my warriors deal with the threat using appropriate methods. And what about Zethkar? Lisa asked, gesturing toward the life support equipment that filled a significant portion of the cave. His medical systems are too complex and power-hungry to be easily moved. The silence that followed her question was more telling than any words could have been. Veltar's compound eyes shifted away from Zethkar's position, while the other Nootka warriors found sudden interest in their equipment displays. It was Dr. Rogers who finally understood what was happening. They're going to leave him behind, he said quietly. Just like they did at the space station, the evacuation ships have limited capacity, Veltar explained with the kind of professional detachment that military officers used when discussing acceptable losses. Scout Zethkar's condition requires resources that could save a dozen other lives. The logical choice is clear. Lisa felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. She had seen this kind of calculation before during her military career, and she understood the reasoning behind it. But understanding something did not mean accepting it. No, she said simply. Veltar's head tilted in what might have been confusion. Captain, you cannot seriously intend to risk an entire colony for one individual who is already severely compromised. That's exactly what I intend, Lisa replied, moving to stand beside Zethkar's life support unit. Nobody gets left behind. That's not negotiable. Around the cave, the human volunteers began to understand what was happening. Mayor Sullivan stepped forward to stand with Lisa, followed by Tom Bradley and Helen Cross. Dr. Rogers moved to check Zethkar's medical connections, while Amy Chen and Bobby Martinez positioned themselves where they could defend the equipment, if necessary. This is illogical, Veltar said, his translated voice showing the first signs of real emotion. You would sacrifice your own people for someone who cannot contribute to the fight. You don't understand humans very well, do you? Amy Chen said with the blunt honesty that only teenagers could manage. We don't abandon our friends just because they need help. Zethkar had remained silent during the exchange, but now his compound eyes focused on Lisa with an intensity that seemed to burn. When he spoke, his translated voice was steady despite the life support tubes that helped him breathe. Captain Martinez, you must listen to logic in this situation. I am a burden that reduces your chances of survival. Protecting me serves no tactical purpose and endangers people who have shown me more kindness than I deserve. Lisa knelt beside his life support unit, her face showing the stubborn expression that had become familiar to everyone in the cave. Zethkar, 3 weeks ago you told me that warriors find their greatest strength in whom they choose to protect. Well, I'm choosing to protect you. She stood and faced Commander Veltar directly. We're staying. All of us. If your people want to help, then help. If not, then get off our planet and let us handle this our own way. The Nootka commander's compound eyes shifted between the human volunteers and his paralyzed countrymen. Military logic dictated that he should simply order the evacuation and leave the humans to face the consequences of their emotional decision. But something in their expressions gave him pause. You would truly risk everything for someone who cannot fight beside you? He asked. He is fighting beside us, Bobby Martinez replied. He's been fighting beside us for weeks. Just because he can't run around with a gun doesn't mean he's not a warrior. Helen Cross nodded in agreement. That alien has taught us things that saved our lives. He's earned his place here. Dr. Rogers looked up from his examination of Zethkar's equipment. Besides, abandoning patients goes against everything I believe in as a physician. We stay. One by one, every human in the cave made the same choice. The teenagers who had learned alien tactics from a paralyzed scout. The farmers and miners who had turned their tools into weapons. The medical personnel who had kept everyone alive during the fighting. All of them chose to remain and face certain death rather than abandon someone who had become part of their community. Commander Veltar observed this display with what might have been amazement. In his experience, most species understood the necessity of sacrificing individuals for the greater good. But these humans seemed to find strength in protecting their weakest members rather than abandoning them. Very well, he said finally. My warriors will assist your defense. But understand that this decision may doom us all. Maybe, Lisa replied. But it's the right decision. Outside the cave, the sound of approaching hunters announced that the final battle was about to begin. But for the first time since the siege started, the defenders were united not just by necessity but by choice. They had chosen to stand together regardless of the cost, and that choice had transformed a group of frightened colonists into something much more dangerous. Zethkar watched the preparations around him with compound eyes that reflected more than just the cave's lighting. For 3 years he had believed that his value as a warrior had ended with his injury. Now he understood that he had simply learned a different way to fight. The final assault began with the ground itself trembling beneath the approaching Void Seekers. 2 massive hunters advanced through the forest, their forms now grotesquely enlarged by the biomass they had consumed during the previous battles. Each creature had grown to nearly 20 feet in height, their adaptive armor crackling with absorbed energy, and their weapons systems glowing with predatory hunger. In the command cave, Zethkar coordinated the combined defense while his life support systems worked overtime to keep his damaged body functional. Tactical displays showed the positions of both human colonists and Nootka warriors as they prepared to make their stand in the mountain passes that led to the settlement. They have identified our command center as their primary target, he reported to the assembled defenders. Both hunters will converge on this position once they break through the outer defenses. Lisa checked her weapons one final time while studying the tactical layout that Zethkar had developed. The plan was complex, requiring precise timing between groups who had barely trained together, but it was their only chance against enemies that had grown stronger with each victory. "Remember what we learned," she said into her communication headset. "Don't try to match their strength. Use their size against them. Make them come to us where we have the advantage." The first hunter struck at the northern approach, where Mayor Sullivan and a mixed team of humans and Nootka warriors had prepared a series of overlapping ambush positions. The creature moved through the forest like a living avalanche, its massive form crushing trees and rocks as it sought the shortest path to its target. But the defenders had learned from their earlier battles. Instead of meeting the hunter head-on, they used the terrain to channel its movement into carefully prepared kill zones. Modified mining equipment and Nootka energy weapons struck from concealed positions while the creature was forced to navigate through narrow mountain passes. "It's working," Sullivan reported as the hunter struggled to respond to attacks coming from multiple directions simultaneously. "The terrain is limiting its mobility just like Zethkar predicted." The second hunter approached from the east, moving more cautiously after observing the fate of its companion. This creature had learned to recognize human tactical patterns and was adapting its approach accordingly. It avoided the obvious ambush sites and found alternative routes that brought it closer to the command cave while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Commander Veltar led the response to this threat, his Nootka warriors using their natural agility to engage the hunter in the kind of mobile combat that their species had perfected over centuries of warfare. But even their advanced weapons and superior training were barely sufficient against an enemy that grew stronger with each exchange. "We are inflicting damage but not fast enough," Veltar reported through the communication system. "This creature is adapting to our tactics more quickly than anticipated." In the cave, Dr. Rogers worked frantically to treat wounded defenders as they were brought back from the fighting. Burns from energy weapons, cuts from debris, and exhaustion from the prolonged battle left many people in need of immediate medical attention. But the medical station was directly in the path that both hunters were taking toward their primary target. "We need to evacuate the wounded," Rogers called out as another explosion shook the cave system. "No time," Lisa replied, watching Zethkar's displays as the hunters converged on their position. "They'll be here in less than 10 minutes. Amy Chen and Bobby Martinez had taken positions near the cave entrance with weapons that Tom Bradley had modified from household electronics and mining tools. They were frightened but determined, having spent weeks learning to fight enemies that most galactic military forces could not defeat. "What do we do when they get here?" Amy asked, her young voice steady despite the terror of their situation. Zethkar's compound eyes focused on her with an intensity that seemed to burn. "We show them what happens when they underestimate the power of beings who refuse to abandon each other." The first hunter breached the outer defenses after sustaining heavy damage from the combined human and Nootka forces. It was wounded and weakened, but still incredibly dangerous as it began its final approach to the command cave. Behind it, the second hunter had broken free from Commander Veltar's warriors and was also closing in on their position. "Both targets converging on the cave system," Zethkar reported, his translated voice remaining calm even as the sounds of approaching destruction grew louder. "Estimated time to contact, 3 minutes." Lisa took position near the cave entrance, while the remaining defenders prepared for close-quarters combat against enemies that were designed to be unstoppable. But as she checked her weapons one final time, she noticed something strange happening to Zethkar's equipment displays. "What are you doing?" she asked, seeing data patterns that she did not recognize. "Something that my people believed was impossible," Zethkar replied, his compound eyes never leaving the tactical screens. "I am attempting to interface directly with the cave's computer systems using an old neural connection technique." Dr. Rogers looked up from his medical work with alarm. "That could kill you. Your nervous system is already damaged. Adding that kind of stress could cause complete neural shutdown." "Perhaps," Zethkar agreed, "but it will also give us precise control over every system in this facility. The mining equipment, the power grid, even the structural supports. Everything becomes a weapon." The first hunter appeared at the cave entrance just as Zethkar completed the neural interface. Pain shot through his already damaged nervous system as his consciousness merged with the facility's computer network, but he forced himself to maintain the connection. Through electronic sensors, he could see the hunters as they entered the cave system. "Now," he whispered, and the mountain itself became their weapon. Mining lasers that had been disguised as structural supports fired simultaneously from concealed positions. Power conduits overloaded in carefully calculated patterns that channeled energy into electromagnetic pulse generators. Even the cave's lighting system became part of the attack as every photon was focused into concentrated beams that struck the hunter's optical sensors. The first hunter staggered under the coordinated assault, its adaptive armor struggling to respond to attacks coming from directions that should have been impossible. Lisa and the other defenders used the confusion to strike at its weakened points, while Zethkar continued to coordinate the electronic offensive despite the neural feedback that was slowly destroying his already fragile brain. "Zethkar," Lisa called out as she saw blood beginning to flow from his compound eyes. "You have to stop. You're killing yourself." "Not yet," he replied, his translated voice growing weaker as his nervous system approached total failure. "The second hunter is still functional." The final moments of the battle blurred together in a chaos of energy weapons, falling debris, and the sound of biomechanical creatures dying in ways that their creators had never intended. Zethkar held the neural interface until both hunters were destroyed, only releasing the connection when the last threat had been eliminated. As silence fell over the cave system, Dr. Rogers rushed to examine the Nootka scout's condition. The neural feedback had caused severe damage to his already compromised nervous system, but somehow his life support systems had kept him alive through the ordeal. "Will he recover?" Lisa asked, kneeling beside the life support unit where Zethkar lay unconscious. "I don't know," Rogers replied honestly. "The neural damage is extensive, but his people's medical technology is far beyond anything I understand. There might be ways to repair this." Commander Veltar entered the cave as the medical evaluation continued, his compound eyes taking in the destruction that had been wrought by the combined human and Nootka defense. 2 Void Seeker hunters lay dead in the tunnels, their biomechanical forms finally still after years of consuming life throughout the galaxy. "This was not supposed to be possible," he said quietly. "Individual hunters have destroyed entire military units, but you stopped 2 of them using improvised weapons and coordinated tactics." "We had a good teacher," Amy Chen replied, gesturing toward Zethkar's motionless form. 3 days later, Zethkar awakened to find himself connected to an advanced Nootka medical unit that Commander Veltar had transported from his ship. The neural damage was severe, leaving him with even less mobility than before, but his mind remained sharp and his determination stronger than ever. "The colony?" he asked, his first words after regaining consciousness. "Safe," Lisa replied from her position beside his medical unit. Everyone made it through. Dr. Rogers says you're going to need months of rehabilitation, but you're going to survive. Zethkar's compound eyes focused on her with an expression that might have been contentment. And what happens now? Lisa smiled as she gestured toward the activity outside the cave. Human colonists and Nootka warriors were working together to rebuild the settlement and establish a permanent defensive alliance. Children played games that combined human creativity with alien tactics, while their parents discussed trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Now we figure out how to live up to what we learned about each other, she said.